Good morning, everybody, and good morning, Lynn. I know Lynn because she's my neighbor just across the way. When I sit on my porch and sneeze, she could say Gesundheit. and sometimes, and I love her dog. She has a great dog. She's taught at Hess before. She taught a course on Christian feminism. She's written a book on Christian feminism. What's the title of that book offhand? It doesn't.
Feminism and Christianity, an Essential
Okay.
Guide.
Very good, very good. And that was her first claim to fame. And then more recently, she wrote about the women of the Old Testament from something like from widows to warriors, I think. And now this book that she's recently come out with is From Daughters to Disciples, about some New Testament women. And it's a delight to have her back. And she's been with the religion department at Hope College for probably at least 20 years. I gave all my information to Phil. I didn't think I was going to be doing this. But has it been about 20 years or more than that?
Almost. This is my 30th year.
Wow, how time flies when you were having fun, right?
Right.
30th year. Good. And she's been a real asset to the college and an asset to Hope Church, where she's a member also and teaches also in the adult education program occasionally there. She, let's see, she went to Hope College. She was attending to become a medical doctor, but she got so excited by Old Testament, New Testament, that she decided to change her direction. There may be a longer story that she can tell later. But anyway, we're grateful that she's studied religion. After that, I think she went, after Hope College, she went out east, probably not New Brunswick, maybe something like Union or
Princeton, and then Union.
Princeton. Oh, Princeton. Okay, right. She has degrees from Princeton and a doctorate from Princeton. And I think she was a pastor of a church or two out in the east as well for a while. So I think that's enough to get you started, Lynn. Take it from here.
Okay, thank you. All right, so I'm sitting outside, so if the sound issue becomes a problem for anybody or the visuals, just let me know, and I can go back inside. All right, yeah, as Judy said, my 30th year at Hope College, so it's mind-boggling to me how this happened. Some of my early students are in their late 40s right now, which is kind of scary to me, but yeah, so I've had a long run there. So I am really a historian, as some of you know, but I've been teaching a feminism class at Hope now for all these 30 years. And each time I teach that, part of it is a section on women in the Bible. And so I've always been interested in how women are portrayed in the Bible, and especially how they get preached about. And so I wrote a book, came out several years ago now, on preaching the women of the Old Testament. And I was looking at the stories, but also at the history of interpretation and how some of the women get treated by commentators and by preachers, which was really disappointing in many ways, because often these women are just trashed by the commentaries as sinners and prostitutes and just stupid and unfaithful, and when in reality they're really very strong women much of the time. So interesting to read about that. So that eventually morphed into the book From Widows to Warriors, which was more of a Bible study. And then Westminster John Knox asked me to also write a New Testament version that would be more of a Bible study. So what that is I'm not sure how well you can see this, but From Daughters to Disciples, women's stories from the New Testament, to go with From Widows to Warriors, women's stories from the Old Testament. So what I'm trying to do in here is a little bit more academic than some Bible studies get to be. I'm really kind of including some of what I would include if I was teaching about the women. So some of the background to the story, some of the details from the text, application issues, relevance issues, those kinds of things. So I'm trying to wrestle with how do we understand these women as they are, and then how are they significant to us? What does their story mean to us? So anyway, that's been an interesting process. It's also, I finished the Daughters to Disciples book, I think 2 years ago now, at least, maybe 3. So I've kind of since moved on to some other projects. So it's always tricky to go back to something that I was once intensely involved in and now haven't really thought about much for the last while, except when I'm called to teach. So if I'm a little fuzzy, that's why my brain has been filled with many other things since then. So, but anyway, welcome all of you. So I want to start by talking a little bit about Anna and Elizabeth. So you may know a little bit about those women. Elizabeth was the older woman that Mary went to when she was pregnant. So Elizabeth is the mother of John the Baptist. And in the Gospel of Luke, the story starts actually with Elizabeth and her husband Zechariah. And Elizabeth is old, and Zechariah is old, and they haven't had any children. And that kind of barrenness in the Bible is a terrible thing, as you may know from reading the stories. Sarah, the mother of Isaac, was barren for a long time. And that barren word is so harsh too, but Rebecca, the mother of Jacob and Esau, was barren for a long time. Rachel, the mother of Joseph, was barren. Hannah, the mother of Samuel, and then the mother of Samson, who's not named. So there's kind of a long tradition of women who are infertile, and it's terrible for them because women's only worth in this culture was having children, particularly sons. And so the idea of a woman's infertility was seen as a way for God to act, for God to do something significant. And you know that in the Bible, if they're going to talk about a woman who's infertile and then has kind of a miraculous fertility, that's going to be a special boy, that's going to be someone who's going to do something. So Isaac and Jacob and Joseph and Samson and Samuel were all going to be these major players in the story of the Old Testament. And then you get to the New Testament and you have the story about Elizabeth, who's barren, and then she's going to give birth to John the Baptist, who will be this great prophet for Jesus. And then you come to Mary, and Mary's not old, she's not infertile, but she doesn't have a man. So how's Mary going to get pregnant, right? So for her, it's not this barrenness, it's the lack of the man. She's seeing Joseph, and she's engaged to him, but it's clear that they haven't slept together yet. So how's Mary going to get pregnant? So it's interesting just to watch this progression of women who are barren and then who miraculously have this baby boy who's going to be special. So that's Elizabeth. So when Mary finds out that she's pregnant, she goes to see Elizabeth. And so again, there's going to be an age difference of probably 50 years or more between these two women. And so it's intriguing to me that that here's Mary pregnant much too early, probably subject to a lot of questions, wonderings, skepticism, shaming even. And Mary travels 90 miles probably to go visit her friend and cousin, it seems, Elizabeth. And again, that's not just happen in the car for 2 hours. That's a 6-day trip of walking 50 miles a day. So think 15 miles a day. So just think about what it took for her to do that. And so she goes to Elizabeth, and Elizabeth, doesn't know right off the bat that Mary's pregnant. And it says when Elizabeth sees Mary, her own baby leapt in her womb. So some kind of kicking or movement or whatever. And then Elizabeth responds with this really powerful comment of blessing. And I'm going to pull up, this is in Luke 1, but I'll read it. Well, actually, yeah, Luke 1, verse 41. When Elizabeth heard Mary's greeting, the child leaped in her womb, and Elizabeth was filled with the Holy Spirit and exclaimed with a loud cry, "Blessed are you among women, and blessed is the fruit of your womb. And why has this happened to me, that the mother of my Lord comes to me? And blessed is she who believed that there would be a fulfillment of what was spoken to her by the Lord." So here, Elizabeth, this older woman, has this kind of prophetic sense. She gets it. She sees that something is significant about Mary. She knows that something is significant about Mary, and she blesses her. She affirms her, and I just think that's a really powerful story of one woman blessing and affirming another. So I want to talk about that a little bit more in a few minutes, but I want you to maybe think about one of the things that intrigues me too about this story is the intergenerational quality of it. I have been blessed in my life to have a lot of friends who are older than I am. And some younger, but in this context, I want to think about the older women. And that started already when I was in my 20s and at church, and I got to be friends with a woman in her 70s who was just such a supportive presence for me. And now that I'm 60, that's not such a gap anymore, but I still have a number of women friends who are older than I am. And it's just been such a gift to me to have that perspective of women's stories and, women's wisdom and experience. And so I guess I just want you to think a little bit about that. Do you have friends that are younger than you? Have you had friends that are older than you? How do those dynamics of friendship work when you're not the same generation? So just contemplate that a little bit, and we'll come back to that. The second woman that I want to talk about in this section is another woman who just has a tiny little reference in the Gospels. So this is in Luke 2, verse 36. So after the birth of Jesus, Mary and Joseph had to take him to the temple to just be kind of dedicated, that sort of thing. And in the temple was a woman who was something like 100 years old. All right, the timing, the dating is a little bit unclear, but in verse 36 it says there was a prophet, Anna. She was of great age, having lived with her husband 7 years after her marriage, then as a widow to the age of 84. So it's not clear whether she had been, married 7 years and then widowed, and now she was 84, or whether she had been widowed for 84 years. Again, this is not a crucial piece, but just interesting that sometimes we don't know for sure what the text says. And then listen, she never left the temple, but worshiped there with fasting and prayer night and day. So she'd been waiting a long time, and she showed up every single day in the temple, waiting for Jesus to come, waiting for this baby. She was expecting something. She was expecting the Messiah. She was expecting the one who would change the whole fortunes of not only Israel, but the world. And so she shows up every day. And I just think that's a really powerful image of here this woman waits and waits and waits for something that hasn't happened. And people might say to her, "Oh, you're so stupid. What are you doing that for? Why do you keep going there? He hasn't shown up yet. This isn't going to happen." And yet she shows up. And I just find that really powerful. And so when Jesus appears, and again, she would have seen how many babies over the years. And each time she knew somehow that this was not the baby that she was waiting for. It was a good baby, but it wasn't the baby that she was waiting for. And so when the moment finally comes in verse 38, at that moment, she came and saw Jesus and began to praise God and to speak about the child to all who were looking for the redemption of Jerusalem. Right? So that's all we know about her. It's odd because Simeon is another guy who's in the temple also waiting like her. And he gets a speech, his speech is recorded in the scripture, and Anna's is not, which is kind of interesting. It just says that she begins praising God and speaking about the child. So already you can see in the text that men's voices are privileged, that we hear more of men speaking than of women, even though they're in a very similar context. So there again, this is a woman of, a woman of a certain age, and she hasn't given up. She hasn't checked out. She hasn't completely retired. All of those things are fine, but she has chosen to continue to be active, much as you're doing by continuing to learn and engage in this kind of format. So, so anyway, those are just two women who I find intriguing. Uh, there's a kind of wisdom here. What I admire about Anna is that she has this wisdom that she is holding on to and she is sharing at the right time. Just find a reference here a minute. So, one of the things that I think our culture does is not necessarily pay much attention to people of a certain age. There's a sense that once you're, quote, old, you don't have much to offer anymore. And that's it. In other cultural contexts, that's treated very differently. Older people are revered for their wisdom and for their ability to see things and to understand things. And so I again, it's I'm speaking to the choir here in a sense because I know you value each other and you value your own wisdom, but that's just something to think about. Alice Walker, who wrote The Color Purple and a number of other novels that you may have read, in her novel, The Temple of My Familiar, she writes that when an elder dies, it is as if a library is burned down. When an elder dies, it's as if a library has burned down. And then she gives these words in the novel to a woman who has studied the ways of the elders in her African community. And this woman says, "One thing I know, learning from one's elders does not permit pessimism. Your day is always easier than theirs. You look at them so beautiful and so wise, and you cannot help trying to emulate them. It is courage given by osmosis, I think." Right? I just find that such a lovely quote. And I've been fortunate to interview a lot of retired clergy and missionaries and RCA staff people. And I'm always so struck by the wisdom that they've had after 50 or more years of ministry and work in the church, and just a kind of calm often and peace and reflection about thinking back on their lives and their work. And I just really appreciate the chance to learn from them. And again, as people of a certain age who are now thinking about their lives, I encourage you to maybe just think about that, journaling, writing about your past. A couple of people I know have actually written their memoirs for their children, and it's been a gift to those kids to read what their parents are saying about their past, their childhood, their young adulthood, their experience of parenting and working and that sort of thing. And so I would encourage you to think about doing that. It doesn't need to be any big deal, but it can be a gift to your children to leave those kinds of memories behind that you have. So anyway, I could say more about those people, but any reflections from you about the questions I've raised about friendships of, cross-generational friendships, or the wisdom of the elders, those kinds of things. Any questions, observations?
Just jump in and anyone and speak up. If no one else jumps in, I want to mention about your comment about from the Walker book about when an old woman dies, it's like a library burned down. I went to a funeral of someone who had lots of jewelry and necklaces and so on, and her daughter, you know who I'm talking about.
Yeah, I do.
Her daughter made sure that that legacy of jewelry would go to people who showed up at the funeral. And so I came home. I'm not a big jewelry person, but I have a very special necklace that reminds me of this woman. And my plans are, maybe Lynn, you can help me carry it out. My plans are to get rid of my books.
Oh.
And I'm hoping that for my funeral, after the reception, people can browse through my book collection and take what they want.
Okay. All right.
I like to plan ahead. I like to plan ahead.
I might get there first and clean it all out. So I can look out my porch window and into Judy's basement office and see all her books. And I am covetous. That's a great example. Anybody else? I know you're not necessarily used to jumping in and speaking in the middle, but any other observations? All right. I was going to skip over Mary because Mary is much better known than most of the other women in the New Testament. But did anybody have any particular questions or issues about Mary, the mother of Jesus, that you might want to ask? Okay. All right. Then we can move on. And I want to look a little bit at the story of the bleeding woman. That's kind of a weird title, but so in Mark 5:21, there's this powerful story of Jesus encountering a woman. And this story actually is in the lectionary. If you go to a church that follows the lectionary on Sunday, it's a set of readings in a 3-year cycle that show up then every year. So you may have heard this story preached before, but it's still an interesting one. So Mark 5, if you have the text with you, verse 21, Jesus was traveling with his disciples, and a man came to him named Jairus, who was a leader of a synagogue. And Jairus came to him and said, "My daughter is sick. Can you come and heal my daughter?" And actually, she's at the point of death. She's about to die. And so Jairus asked Jesus to come and touch her. And Jairus had such faith that he said to Jesus, "If you come and touch her, I know she will be healed." So Jesus went with him. But he was traveling with the disciples in the midst of a large crowd of people. And so now I'll just turn to the text here in verse 25, and I'll kind of augment it once in a while with some other commentary. There was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. All right, so think about what that meant. Some kind of bleeding disorder, probably some kind of uterine bleeding disorder that would go on for 12 years. So again, think about what it was like having a period once a month for your adult life, and think about that all the time. Think also about the fact that in Judaism, bleeding was a sign of uncleanness. So just as every month of a woman's period, she was considered unclean for not only the week of the actual bleeding, but for the week following. And so she wasn't supposed to touch her husband anything that she touched would be kind of contaminated. She wasn't supposed to sit anywhere that somebody else would sit. So often women who had their periods were kind of relegated to some other kind of tent, the red tent, Anita Diamant calls it in her novel. So women were sort of separated from other people at the time because of this uncleanness. So again, think about what this woman is experiencing. With 12 years of bleeding, she's also had 12 years of uncleanness. So again, no touching, no community, no sharing food, none of those kinds of things. So again, we can kind of skip over that sometimes reading this story and, she had a bleeding disorder, But no, I want you to think about how much she would be affected by this, how much her life would have been shaped by this 12 years of disease. All right, so going on, I'm in verse 26 now. She had endured much under many physicians and had spent all that she had, and she was no better, but rather grew worse. Okay, so again, think about the fruitless search. If any of you have had a kind of, especially a kind of autoimmune disease, or if you know people who've had, you know that people are trying for years sometimes to figure out what is wrong with them. And they know they're sick, they know their body's not right, but nobody can figure out what it is. And so people start to say, oh, it's all in your head, that kind of thing. So again, think about the struggle of trying to get healed for 12 years. She had heard about Jesus, and she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. So again, think about a crowd of people, think about Tulip Time, think about Disney World, think about, something with a lot of people. And you can kind of see what she's thinking, that she knows Jesus has this reputation as a healer. She doesn't want to confront him because if she touches him, she spreads her uncleanness to him, right? And people don't like that. Men don't like that. A strange man, a healer, doesn't want to be touched by a woman who's unclean, right? So she's going to kind of sneak up in the crowd and reach out and touch his clothes. And she has such deep faith in him that she thinks that will heal her. And so she does it, touches him. Sorry. And it says that immediately her hemorrhage stopped and she felt in her body that she had been healed of her disease. Okay, so she's right. She has this faith. She touches him. She feels healed. And then what? She wants to just get out of there, right? She wants to just slink away into the crowd and disappear. But Jesus also knew that something had happened. And so, immediately aware that power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" Now, again, think about how the tone of voice would matter here. Is Jesus saying, "Who touched my clothes?" in a kind of angry, accusative way? Or is he just more curious? Who touched my clothes? Right? And the disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing in on you. How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus looked around to see who had done it. The woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, which is interesting. She's terrified of being found out, of being punished for having touched this man. She fell down before him and told him the whole truth. Jesus said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." Right? So that last statement is so powerful. First of all, he calls her daughter, right? And think about that. If she had had a man in her life, the man would have been asking for healing the way that Jairus did for his daughter. So she seems not to have had anyone, a husband, a son, a brother. She's doing it herself, right? And so she's not really anybody's daughter anymore. So just think about what Jesus is saying to her. You're a daughter, right? You're someone. You're a person with relationships and value. And he affirms her faith. He knows what it took for her to do that. And he knows that she must have had this incredible faith in him to think that just touching his clothes would have healed her. So Jesus affirms that. And when that fact that she's healed, the word in Greek for healing is sozo, which means salvation. Basically, it's translated salvation often. And so she's not only healed in a sense of physically, she's saved in a very holistic sense. And often in especially more conservative evangelical traditions in America, saved has become this word that means I've got this ticket to heaven, and I've said the magic words and I've uttered the magic phrases and I've taken Jesus into my heart and I have a personal relationship with him and now I'm going to go to heaven. That's what salvation seems to mean in a lot of contexts. But in the biblical text, salvation really means something much bigger than that. It's about wholeness. It's about healing of the body and the soul. It's about the whole being changed and healed and brought to completion. So it's a really powerful kind of understanding. So again, just a really interesting story about this woman. And you notice that he doesn't shame her. There's no punishment. There's no, you shouldn't have touched me. There's no, oh, you dirty woman, what did you touch me for? None of that. He just treats her with this respect and regard, and he acknowledges her as a person and as a person of faith. And she's already healed. He doesn't have to decide to heal her. She just is. So really powerful story. Just another quick example or connection of this one. Sorry, I should have had this marked. One feminist theologian that I like told the story of a woman who, this was early on, probably in the 70s, a woman who had just struggled with a sense of calling and always felt excluded from the church, and women couldn't be priests or pastors or whatever. And she talked about one day going to a worship service and hearing someone say, "You are a daughter of God. You're a daughter of God." And just being so profoundly moved by that, because so much of our language in the church is sons of God and men of God and that kind of thing, and just to hear those words, "You are a daughter of God," were so profoundly affirming to her. And I just think that's really significant. That's why language matters. That's why inclusive language matters. That's why I don't particularly like singing a hymn where I have to refer to myself as a son of God, or liturgical words about men of God and that sort of thing. It's important to include people so that they feel welcomed. And so again, Jesus affirming this woman as a daughter of God is just a powerful story here. We can talk more about that if you've got questions, but remember though that the whole context of this is Jairus's daughter, right? Jairus coming to Jesus was the spark of this little trip that he's on. But the text goes on, when he was still speaking to the woman, this is in verse 35, some people came from Jairus's house to say, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" So again, think about Jairus's response to this. Here, Jesus has been dilly-dallying in the street, talking to this woman, who Jairus might have thought, "Ugh, unclean, stay away from me." So while Jairus is feeling this anxiety of, can we get on with it, please? Can we go? My daughter's dying. sure enough, his worst fears are fulfilled here, and he gets the word that his daughter is dead. But Jesus doesn't buy that, or it's not the last word. And so Jesus says to Jairus, do not fear, only believe. And it's interesting that the word for believe there is the same word that has been used for the woman, right? She has had faith, she has believed, she has trusted, right? And so now she's being used as kind of a role model in a way. You know, Jairus is being told, have the same kind of faith that this woman had. Right? Trust me, in a way, that's what it is. And so again, it's interesting to think about how in the scripture here, belief is not a kind of thing that says, you know, do you believe this academic idea? Do you believe this intellectual question? Do you believe in the, you know, the details of the Nicene Creed that Jesus was very God of very God, true God of true God? You know, it's not really about the intellect ultimately. It's about trust. It's about putting your life into someone's hands. And so it's that kind of relationship that's more important to faith really than kind of the intellect. Not that that's not important, but it's not the key thing. All right. So do not fear, only believe. And so Jesus went again toward the house of Jairus, and he took some of the disciples. And when they came to the house of Jairus, there was a commotion. People were weeping and wailing loudly. And when Jesus entered, he said to them, why do you make a commotion and weep? And they laughed at him, as you might, you know, she's dead, very dead, right? But they don't have the faith either. So the laughing and the mocking is a sign that they don't have faith. But again, you can understand why, right? Dead is dead. But Jesus put them all outside. All the unbelievers, all the laughers went outside. And Jesus took the child's father and mother and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, Talitha cum, which means, little girl, get up. And immediately the girl got up and began to walk about. She was 12 years of age. At this, they were overcome with amazement. He strictly ordered them that no one should know this and told them to give her something to eat. Okay, now, interesting ending, right? The no one should know this is part of a broader context of what's called the messianic secret in Mark, that Mark is cautious about revealing his identity until later. And so it's kind of a secret that some people know and others don't. So don't talk about this too much, he says. But then the give her something to eat is like, yeah, this is real, people. This isn't just pretend. She's really alive now, and so feed her, right? But then that other piece, the 12 years, do you catch the connection there? How long had the woman had her disease? 12 years, right? How old is the daughter? 12 years. So it's an interesting kind of story within a story linked by this age of the girl and time of the disease. So again, kind of a brilliant, whether that's true, actually factual, or whether that's Mark's way of connecting the two stories is interesting. But anyway, it's fascinating. So questions, observations, connections.
Lynn, thank you for the story. As a retired nurse who hasn't nursed for many, many years, but this woman bleeding for 12 years would have been so exhausted. Amazing that she found the power and the strength to get to Jesus. I mean, that to me I never thought of it before
Yep,
like that.
yep,
But
yep.
pointing that out, it's just like, wow, how could other men brought men to Jesus,
Mhm.
but
Uh-huh.
she alone found her way
Uh-huh.
to get there. I thought
Right,
that was amazing.
right. No,
And then,
that's, yeah, go
yeah,
ahead.
and then to be called daughter,
Mhm.
we are children of God, and to think maybe she's the first person that Jesus addressed as one of his children. I don't know.
Mhm.
I don't know that part, whether
Uh-huh.
there's people before this that we heard about.
I
But
don't think there would be a daughter reference before this,
oh,
at
yeah.
least not in Mark.
And I think that's pretty special too.
Yeah, yep, it is. It is. Right. Um, it's interesting too to think about touch now, right? After COVID. It's interesting. I was reading the proofs of this book. And when did they come out? Maybe this past summer, or yeah, in the summer or the fall or something. I had the proofs, and it was just kind of interesting in the midst of COVID, when everything was still so locked down, to read what I'd said before COVID about touch, and so I think COVID has made us realize how important it is that we touch each other, that we have the freedom to hug or to embrace or to just touch somebody's arm or to be within 6 feet of other people. It's interesting how COVID has made that kind of so much more significant. Um, so the touch issue is really important here. The fact that she reaches out to touch him, that Jesus isn't offended. Um, it always makes me think about Princess Diana, because do you remember, in the few years before she died, I mean, the AIDS crisis was full blown in the late 80s. So it would have been, 10 years before she died. But there was a picture of her, um, fairly early on in the AIDS crisis, and she's visited a hospital, um, and she is not masked up or gowned up, and she's shaking someone's hand who has AIDS. And again, now looking back, we think, oh, we know it's sexually transmitted, it's not going to be. But in the late 80s, early 90s, that was still a big thing. So for her to be willing to touch someone with this disease is a pretty powerful signal. And it just reminds me of Jesus and this story. So other questions or?
I put a comment in chat.
Okay, all right.
I don't see it. I don't see the comment in chat, Phil.
You may have
I
just
will.
written it to Susan.
Oh, okay.
You want to just
I
say
will-
it otherwise?
Can you just talk it?
I hope so. I have some difficulty with my Chromebook here, but this story has some parallel with Lazarus' story.
Mhm.
In both cases, an interruption happens before Jesus responds to the death.
Mhm.
And in this one also, I see a similar, less than friendly crowd response once Jesus gets there. But while Lazarus is very frequently lifted up as a prefigure to Jesus' own resurrection, I'm wondering, do we ever hear this little girl highlighted in such a way?
No.
There's even
No.
that connection with when Jesus shows up after his resurrection. Have you got anything to eat? One of his questions.
Uh-huh.
And here he has that same concern for the girl.
Yeah.
For heaven's sake, give her something to eat.
Right. Oh, I had never really thought about that. That's interesting. Huh. Good. Yeah, fascinating. Thank you.
But I've always liked that connection there, the touch of
Mhm.
Jesus lifted up by the hand and say,
Right.
get up, arise,
Mm-hmm.
come back to life.
Right. Yeah. Huh. Somebody
Wasn't
else
eating,
Go ahead, Judy.
it wasn't eating some proof of being alive. I mean, you weren't
Mhm.
just a figment of
Right.
somebody's imagination, or like you
Right,
said, you
yeah.
had said something like that, but eating was important. Jesus ate with the two men on the
Right.
road, right? And
Right. Yep. Exactly.
yeah.
Yeah. And interesting that, as people are dying, they stop eating. And so gradually just don't eat and their body shuts down. And interesting too, the contrast, like, okay, food, you need food, you're alive. So that is a great connection. Thank you.
Is the story of Jairus' daughter in any of the other gospels, or is it only in Mark?
Yes, it's in Matthew.
Is it told any differently, or is it pretty similar?
No, it's pretty similar. Oh, it's also in Luke. No, sorry.
Oh,
Yeah, it is.
okay.
It is also in Luke. I think
Okay.
it's interesting in Luke. It's in Luke 8. So let me just look at this a minute. Yeah, I was thinking that the doctor reference wasn't there in Luke, but it is. It still says she spent all she had on physicians and no one could cure her. So no, it's pretty similar. If I looked more carefully at it, I probably would find a couple of differences, but there's nothing really major here.
Okay,
So
okay.
yeah, so all three gospels tell this story. All right, anybody else? I mean, one of the tricky things about preaching this and talking about it is the sense of, okay, this woman is healed and that's great, but I've been reaching out to Jesus and praying or whatever for years too, and I'm not being healed, right? So how does it make you feel if you are someone who's been ill for a long time, to hear this story and see that Jesus healed somebody else, but you're not being healed? And so religious people have messed with that for quite a while, and then it's sometimes like, well, I'm not sure why I'm getting this ad on about Hope College.
Right, I'm getting it too, and I'm not sure why in the world that's happening.
Yeah. Well, hopefully it'll
Susan
go away.
around, she can fix that. Susan, can you fix this? We're getting an ad.
We've run out of it.
Well, enlarge your screen so you see just Lynn. You can change your screen shape maybe and enlarge Lynn's picture and make the other screen go away. That's what I'm doing.
Okay.
You can drag Lynn's picture so she covers more of the screen. Okay.
All right. Well, anyway, so that's kind of the one drawback about working with this text is the relevance, and the pain of people who aren't healed. So again, just to be aware of that, I guess. And I know where I was going with it when the video showed up. Often in the Christian tradition, there's been an assumption that, well, if you're not healed, it's because you lack faith, right? So the woman has faith and she trusts in Jesus to heal her. And if that's not happening to you, it's because your faith is deficient somehow. And I don't think that's what the text is saying at all, but it's often been read like that. And a disease is seen as a kind of, it's a shaming thing. It's a sign that you're sinful. It's a sign that you don't have enough faith. And so I think we still wrestle with those kinds of questions now. What does it mean when people aren't healed, when they get prayed and prayed and prayed for, and they're not healed, right? So that's just, I've got no answers to that, but it's just something to be aware of with this kind of story, that's the flip side of it. All right, anything else? These are great comments. All right. Okay, then the next one I'd like to talk about is the woman who was bent over. So this is in Luke 13. All right, Luke 13, starting at verse 10. So in this story, Jesus is teaching in one of the synagogues, and it's the Sabbath, right? So Saturday, but the day of Jewish worship. And again, if you're familiar with the Old Testament, you know that there are a lot of rules about the Sabbath and what you can do and how you act. And you're not supposed to work. It's a day of rest, just as Jesus, or as God rested on the seventh day after 6 days of creation. Human beings are supposed to rest, and they're not supposed to work. And it's supposed to be a kind of freedom. It's supposed to give everybody, including slaves and household help, a kind of a day of rest. Obviously, it doesn't always work that way. But the idea of Sabbath rest is a positive one. But it's also gotten so, messed up over time that it gets pretty legalistic, and I don't know about you, but when I was growing up, we still had some Sunday rules in my house. They didn't always make a lot of sense. So we weren't supposed to go to the beach, but we could go to our neighbor's pool. So okay, that didn't make sense. We didn't go to restaurants. We didn't go do grocery shopping. We didn't go to the mall on Sunday. So it was just these rules about how you keep Sunday. And that's the same thing that Jesus is experiencing here. Okay. So he's in the synagogue on the Sabbath, and just then there appeared a woman with a spirit that had crippled her for 18 years. She was bent over and quite unable to stand up straight. Okay, so think about, she's got some like a widow's hump, a dowager's hump, it's called. But she's like almost completely bent over at a 90-degree angle. We don't know to what degree, but imagine that, this being bent over to such a degree, right? Now, when Jesus called her or saw her, he called her over to him. Now again, so this is not her initiative. This is not about her faith. This is not about her knowing anything about Jesus. This is totally Jesus' initiative, right? And he says to her, "Woman, you are set free from your ailment." Right? And when he laid hands on her, there's that touch again. Immediately she stood up straight and began praising God. Right? So again, think about the miraculous nature of this healing here, but that also that Jesus is just giving this to her. It doesn't depend on her faith, on her initiative, on her asking. He just chooses to heal her. And then the story becomes bigger. It's no longer just about her. It becomes more of a debate between Jesus and the Jewish leaders at the time. So the leader of the synagogue, this is in verse 14, indignant because Jesus had cured on the Sabbath, kept saying to the crowd, "There are 6 days on which work ought to be done. Come on those days and be cured, and not on the Sabbath day." Because any healing was a kind of work that you weren't supposed to do. But Jesus answered and said, "You hypocrites! Does not each of you on the Sabbath untie his ox or his donkey from the manger and lead it away to give it water? And ought not this woman, a daughter of Abraham," there's that daughter language again, "whom Satan bound for 18 long years, be set free from this bondage on the Sabbath day?" Right? It's an act of mercy, he's saying, just like you would feed and water your animals on the Sabbath day, so I should be able to heal this woman. When he said this, all his opponents were put to shame, and the entire crowd was rejoicing at all the wonderful things that he was doing. Right? So again, it's the story of a healing of this woman, but it also becomes a way in which Jesus kind of says something significant about himself. He is in a debate with the crowd over the Sabbath, and he clearly is the winner of the debate. But it's also something that makes people dislike him even more, the fact that he's breaking those Sabbath rules. All right, so interesting. So think about some of the ways that people are bound or crippled. Again, that word isn't necessarily politically correct so much anymore, but think about the ways that people are bound up by disease or expectations or whatever. Again, you've lived a long life and you know some of the dynamics that women have experienced in the last, 75 years or whatever. And it's not always been great. It always strikes me that, in the 60s, women couldn't get credit cards in their own names, right? They had to have their husband co-sign on a credit card. So it's interesting to think about the achievements of feminism and how it's relatively recently that women were really kept from doing a lot of things that we assume now are the norm. So think about those, some of the ways that women have been bound historically. Have you ever seen the pictures of Chinese women in the 19th century and before whose feet have been bound? And, starting at birth, upper class baby girls, their feet were just tightly wrapped in cloth or whatever. And so tightly that they never grew. So they just got to be, they're almost like smaller than a hand, their feet, and they're all misshapen and bent. And the idea was that, well, these women are never going to work and they're never going to have to work. And so these feet show that they can live this life of leisure and they're going to be cared for their whole life. So it was a class symbol in many ways. But it also was a clear check on their mobility and their ability to do anything, right? So, so that's an interesting kind of symbol of bondage for women. Are you familiar with what it's called, goes by several different terms, genital cutting, sometimes female genital mutilation? There are places in the Middle East and in Africa that cut off various parts of women's genitalia, and the girls they're babies, or they're 5 or they're 10, sometimes they're as old as 14. And again, it's an idea of for cleanliness and for purity and for fidelity. So if women are kept from any kind of sexual pleasure, then they won't stray, they won't be, terrible women. But again, imagine growing up with, and being an adult woman and not having the parts that produce the sexual pleasure, right? And so that's typical in a number of cultures. It's starting to change, but it's still so much the norm in some cultures that even if a girl grows up in a family that doesn't want to do it, she is, going to have a harder time getting married because nobody's going to want to marry a girl who is impure and unclean like that. So again, notice the inversion here, that woman's natural state of having pleasurable parts is seen as unclean, and cutting off those parts is seen as a good thing, So again, just another example of some of the many ways that women have been bound. Think about
this is done by women.
Yes,
Two other women.
yes,
This
exactly.
Is done, this is not done by a male physician.
Right.
The women
right.
themselves who have undergone this same treatment are enforcing it on the next generations.
Mm-hmm. Right. And that's what's so painful and frustrating about it, I think. Yeah. So, you can, other kinds of things. I mentioned chronic diseases a little bit ago and how much bondage that puts people in. Think about the lack of birth control. Again, we assume now, and, for most of you, birth control has been an option for much of your adult life, but it wasn't before. And so think about, Margaret Sanger has this famous, Margaret Sanger is the woman who really got birth control available and going in the 1920s and such. And, she has this famous story about a woman saying to her doctor, how can I keep from having any more children? I've had like 8 already and she's sick and struggling. And the doctor says, well, tell Jake to sleep on the roof. And that was the best they could do for birth control, So think about how what a difference it has made in women's lives to have the pill available and easily, easily used. It doesn't mean that it always worked, but way better than other options or no options. So, but there are still some places in the world where birth control is not an option. It's not available. And those women then are bound to their bodies, to the repeated childbearing, which again, I've got nothing against childbearing. I have 2 of my own, but we want to be able to control it and to limit it as necessary. All right. So anyway, you can probably think of some other examples, but just making sure that I don't have any other. So again, one of the interesting things here is just the idea of being seen, right? It says early on in the story, Jesus saw her, right? And that seems sort of like, oh yeah, whatever, he sees her. But think about how we adjust ourselves to not seeing so much in the world, right? Not seeing people who are obviously handicapped. We're not supposed to stare, right? So we train ourselves just not to look at people. We train ourselves not to see the people who are panhandling, who are homeless. So we've done just a really good job at not seeing, because seeing is so hard. And yet Jesus sees her, and that happens in so many of the stories that he just pays attention. And then he also calls her daughter of Abraham, which is similar in many ways to the reference to daughter before, but here it's even more. This woman is a daughter of the Jewish faith, right? She's a part of it. And again, for having an 18-year disability, she wasn't unclean in the same way that the woman bleeding was, but she would have been ostracized, because to have a disease for that long would suggest that you were really a sinful person, that something was off about you, that God was punishing you with this disease. So she would have been as unwelcome and as ostracized as the bleeding woman. And so for Jesus to see her, to call her over to him, to touch her, to call her daughter of Abraham, all of those were really radical things that Jesus does. So interesting dynamic. All right. Yeah, any other questions, observations about this story?
I have known a few people who have had back issues like that, who only can look to the ground. So one time when we were talking with somebody like that out in a field, actually it was the field where we built the hospice house, but the owner of the property was like that. And someone got down on his haunches and looked up into his face to talk with him. And that was and he was a man of God. He's a man of God. And I, that the people, she could not have looked up at Jesus in her position. And so for Jesus to find her was, very, very wonderful.
Yep.
And then I have another story of a friend who was like that, and she was in the hospice house, and the day before she died, she was walking with her walker bent down. She stood up straight.
Really? Huh.
And the nurses there, I knew this lady for a long time, and the nurses there told me that story afterwards. And I think of that when I hear this story, because Jeanette got to stand up straight the day before she could stand up straight forever.
Wow. Okay. Good. Thank you. Anybody else? Questions or observations? Okay. Okay. Yeah, Phil, I'm seeing your question now showing up on chat, but that's the before one. Okay, great. Anybody else? One of the interesting things to look at here is is who Jesus is in these stories. And one of the reasons that I take so much time to talk about the details and the rules and the culture, the customs of the culture, is that when you understand those more, you know how radical Jesus was in many ways. And, it's easy enough for us to look back on these stories and say, oh yeah, Jesus was nice to women, and he was. But it wasn't just being nice to women. Jesus was really breaking a lot of rules at the time in the way that he interacted with women. And so I just think it's important to see not just that he was nice to women, but he was doing it at some threat to his own, well-being. Breaking rules did not go over well, and it got him killed in the end, right? So just important to understand kind of what's going on here, and the depth of his challenging the rules when he heals somebody on the Sabbath and when he touches somebody who's unclean and that kind of thing. So,
Lynn, are you going to talk about the Syrophoenician woman? Because I think his interaction with her is pivotal.
Yeah, I can certainly do that. Yeah, we can maybe do that a little more briefly, but let's look at that one. Okay, so Mark 7. So back to just a couple pages after the other one. This is a tinier story, but it's really significant in so many ways. All right, so Jesus had been healing. He was very busy, and people were coming at him all the time and touching him and that sort of thing. And I sometimes wonder if Jesus was an introvert like I am, because he tries to get away and get some peace and quiet. But even then, even when he's trying to escape and find some privacy, this woman finds him. All right, so we're in Mark 7, verse 25 now. A woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit immediately heard about him, and she came, she found him in this other place he was at, and she came and bowed down at his feet. Right, so very subservient action. So she tracked him down, she found him, she followed him, she fell at his feet. Now this is, remember, a guy who just wants to kick back on the lazy boy and rest for a little while, right? And so if that wasn't annoying enough, she's a Gentile, she's an outsider, right? So remember again that Jews have been taught for their whole lives, for centuries, that Gentiles were bad. They were not God's chosen people. They needed to be avoided. You stay away from Gentiles. They're dangerous. We don't like them. Keep your distance, right? So Jesus had been taught that too, as a good Jewish boy. But so this woman, again, she's not only annoying, she's a foreigner. And she had the gall to beg Jesus to cast the demon out of her daughter. Now, again, if there'd been a man in her life, he would have been the one doing this. So she's showing her vulnerability by having to ask this favor of him. And Jesus, gentle, loving, healing Jesus, who is always taking care of people all the time, never says no to anybody, here says no. He said to the woman, let the children be fed first. And by that he means the Jewish people. For it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs. All right, so this is problematic on several levels. First of all, he's referring to this Gentile woman as a dog, basically, in this metaphor. She is not one of the chosen children. She's a dog, right? So it's pretty insulting, really. There's also this assumption that his priority is to the Jewish people. And again, given the whole history of Judaism, that's understandable. But so Jesus is refusing to help her based on her ethnicity, right? Now, well, I'll say more about that in a minute. Now, if you had gone to ask a favor of somebody and they had blown you off and said, no, I'm not going to help you. You're like a dog to me. Wouldn't you be inclined to just kind of slink off and say, oh, sorry, sorry, and decide that this guy was really kind of rude and nasty and mean-spirited, and maybe you had him pegged wrong all along? Be easier just to escape, right? But she does not. She talks back, which is what I love about this story. She persisted, in the words of Elizabeth Warren, well, not the words of Elizabeth Warren, somebody describing her. And she kind of takes his words and turns them around. And she says, sir, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. So she's basically saying, you may think of me as a dog, and I'll live with that. But there's enough. She says, I'll take the crumbs of your healing. I'll take whatever's left. I'll take what I have to pick up off the floor. But I know that you can heal my daughter, and I know there's enough grace and healing to go around. Right? I mean, think about the courage and the chutzpah that she has in order to talk back to Jesus. It's amazing. And Jesus sees that. And it's like he's kind of learned something from her, or he's caught up in this and he's struck by it, and he says, for saying that, you may go. The demon has left your daughter. So she went home, found the child lying on the bed, and the demon gone. Right? So, fascinating story about a woman who talks back. But it's also fascinating to think about what's Jesus doing in this story. Jesus seems to learn something from this woman, right? Now, some commentators and preachers are very skittish about that. They don't want Jesus learning something because Jesus is supposed to be divine and perfect, and he can't possibly learn anything from anybody else, which is problematic on a number of levels. But commentaries and preachers often want to kind of mess with this text a little bit, and they want to say, he was just testing her, He just wanted to see if she really had faith. So he was just messing with her mind by saying that he didn't want to heal her at first. Or they say he had a twinkle in his eye, or he was smiling as he said it, or something. And they try to get Jesus off the hook. They don't want Jesus to look like kind of a jerk in many ways in this story. So people are quick to kind of tweak the story a little bit to make Jesus look less offensive. But I don't know about that. I think she just caught him in a sense. And maybe he, as one commentary said, he was caught with his compassion down on this particular day. And, he was tired and he'd had enough of people pawing at him and touching him, and he just needed some space. So anyway, but that's the really interesting dynamic of this story. Does he learn from her? Does he change his mind? But certainly after this incident, he is much more open to healing Gentiles, and he is clearly not just come for the Jews. He's here for Gentiles too. So anyway, interesting story. So the idea of persisting, of resisting is interesting here. But I am also struck by the fact that she hung in there with him. I think it's very easy when we get into a conflict with somebody to just let it go, to kind of slink away and not to engage. She could have said, as I hinted earlier, she could have said, oh man, this guy he's not who I thought he was. He's mean-spirited and grumpy. But instead, she kind of put a positive face on it. It's as if she said, yeah, maybe he's tired. Maybe there's more to this story, maybe he's got more going on than I can see. And so just her ability to kind of reframe the story a little bit and give him the benefit of the doubt is a skill that many of us could use, I think, in our family relationships and other kinds of contexts, that we're often quick to think the worst of somebody. And sometimes if we reframe a situation, we might see that there's a lot of need or sadness or loneliness or exhaustion in a person who's being kind of snappy. There's more to that story. So anyway, questions, comments? Do you usually go all the way to 11 or do you stop a little early? What's the deal? Oops, Judy, you're muted. Judy, you're muted. Oops. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. That's okay. If there are no comments, classes can end early, but if there are more comments,
Okay.
we can stick around until 11.
I mean, I can do one more. I can
Pardon?
do one more story too.
Let's
so.
do one more story for sure.
Okay. Okay, great. All right, let's, Judy had asked specifically that I talk about the Samaritan woman. So we might not finish this, but the Samaritan woman is in John 4. And Samaritans were a kind of Gentile. Samaritans were sort of half-breeds. About 5 centuries earlier, when the Israelites had been carried off and dispersed, and other nations kind of got into Israel, and there was a lot of intermarriage going on. So the Samaritans were people who were partly Jewish in their heritage, but also partly Gentile. So they were impure. And so the Samaritans were not liked by Jews. They were considered unclean, all kinds of problems. So here's this Samaritan woman, and Jesus meets her at a well, and he asks her for a drink. And she says, "Why are you asking me that? Samaritans, Jews do not want to have anything to do with Samaritans, and why would you ask me to drink out of my bucket? Most Jewish people would rather do anything than touch me or my bucket or ask me for a favor." But Jesus engages with her, and they have this conversation, and it's a very theological conversation about worship and where God is and where true worship happens and that kind of thing. And she's obviously bright and engaging, and she asks Jesus a lot of questions, and and she's really thoughtful and interested. And at one point, Jesus tells her to go away and bring back her husband, because Jesus wants to tell, more people about the gospel, the kingdom, and that sort of thing. And then she says, "Well, I have no husband." And Jesus says to her, "You are right in that you have no husband, but you have had 5 husbands, and the one you are living with now is not your husband." And so again, because of that phrase, this woman also often gets labeled as, oh, she's some kind of slut, she's had all these husbands, or she's a really bad wife because 5 men have left her, or she's like the Black Widow, she's caused 5 men to die because she's so miserable to live with, or whatever. So there's all kinds of commentary baggage about her, and people will say, well, she's kind of stupid, she doesn't really understand what Jesus was talking about. They're very demeaning of her. And so it's just interesting to read this story and to think about how she really is theologically astute and engaging with Jesus. It also strikes me that the tone of voice, again, is important here. I was sitting in church one day, and we were having a kind of a choral reading of this story because it's very long. And the person who is reading Jesus' part, just said this in a very compassionate way. "Yeah, you've had 5 husbands, and the one you're with now is not your husband." But I think often it would get read as, "Yeah, you've had 5 husbands," in this kind of derogatory tone, that Jesus is really trashing her. But again, it's not necessarily like that. All right. But anyway, when I wrote the chapter on this book, I started off with a telling a story, putting Jesus into a contemporary context. So I want to read this for you and just think about it. We can, if we don't have time to talk about it, we can continue next week. All right. So just listen to this kind of parable about Jesus traveling in Texas today. Jesus and his disciples were passing through El Paso on the way to San Antonio. The disciples left Jesus in the center of town and went to the store to buy groceries. Jesus was too hungry to wait, so he went to a food truck and bought some rice and beans. He started talking in fluent Spanish with a woman who worked in the truck. She was an undocumented immigrant from Guatemala. Jesus said the food was great. Do you run this all by yourself? Well, she said, that's a long story. I have time, Jesus said. The woman said, I have a partner who owns the truck. I do the cooking and selling. Jesus said, I'm guessing it is more complicated than that. Yes, she said, I work really hard, but he doesn't pay me. Whenever I ask him for my wages, he threatens to turn me into the immigration authorities. Is there anyone else you can go to? Jesus asked. No, she said. I have a son. He's in school and he has asthma. And there's a clinic here that helps him for free. How did you end up with this man? Jesus asked. I was desperate to find a place to live. I was with a man who was beating me, so I had to leave. Before that, I was with a man I really loved who was kind to me, but he got deported. I had never married him because I'm married to a man in Guatemala, but he was put in prison 15 years ago. I left Guatemala then because I was afraid I would be put into prison too. I'm sorry, Jesus said. That is a difficult life. Then the disciples came back and wondered why he was talking to a Latina woman who ran a food truck. But they said nothing because Jesus was always hanging out with unexpected people. All right. So there's just a slightly different way to look at the story in more contemporary language. And it's a way to say, you know, there may have been reasons why she had 5 husbands, which had nothing to do with her being a slut or a whore or a bad woman. So it's an interesting piece to the story. But again, I'm just always struck by how willing commentators and then sometimes preachers are to really dismiss these women as bad or as stupid or as limited or as making poor choices when the text really does not give a lot of information. So again, I would just say listen for that in sermons and don't always trust. My preachers are fabulous, but I've also heard enough that aren't so fabulous. But don't always trust what preachers say about the text because they are sometimes using commentaries that really were not fair to women in the first place. So anyway, that's my caution for the day. Phil, I'm sure that was never you. So I don't mean to trash clergy in general, but just be cautious about what you're hearing. Ask questions. Any other responses or questions that you have about these stories or the kind of the whole exercise?
At this point, I think I want to thank you, Lynn, for letting us join you. I like the way that I feel like I'm just like sitting across the table from you. Some people, downplay Zooms because they think it's not personal enough. But I feel like I'm sitting across the table from you and sipping some coffee while we're just having this chat together. And I hope that others in this class had a similar feeling about how you don't have to necessarily have a lot of PowerPoint slides and all that stuff. You can just simply talk face to face and listen. We've learned a lot and we really appreciate this. Is there anything that we should think about before and prepare for next week?
No, I will just continue, with some of these stories, some different ones. And I would say maybe think about how many sermons have you heard about women in the Bible? And what women and what have the sermons been like? And um, just contemplate that over the week, and that would be great. All right. So I will see you next week. So thanks, everybody. Thanks for all the good questions, and thanks for showing up. And I will look forward to seeing you next week. So thanks,
Thank you,
everybody.
Lynn.
Thanks, Judy. Okay. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Phil, for filling in.
I'm sorry, my computer didn't work. I missed the chance to give my glowing introduction.
Oh, well, maybe next week, Phil.
Well, I'm thinking, well, there's enough people here, but it was until about a minute before I got onto the computer there that I was necessarily busy in the bathroom, let's say. So I was glad that Phil was going to do this, but then it turned out that, I could introduce this, I wasn't as prepared as I should be.
That's fine.
But
No problem.
I want to set the tone too, that you don't have to be always perfect. Things we're all human, and I think it worked out very well.
Right. Well, thanks. All right. Well, hey, thanks everybody. Yeah, Judy, glad to see you're doing all right. So if you want me to push Phil around the circle, I'm happy to do that. So.
Oh, while we had the class, Ginger Clark showed up, and she's doing it right now.
Oh, okay. All right.
And Carol, my sister, was going grocery shopping, and so the phone rang twice. I had to mute for that. And I think Bill, I said, I've instructed Bill, don't answer the phone, don't let the answering machine get it. But it rang a second time, and he picked it up, and it was Ginger saying she wanted to give Bill a ride. And so that's what's happening now, I think. So lots of activity.
Right. Okay, well, just let me know. So
yep.
Just come get me on the porch. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Okay,
Take
sure.
care. Bye.
Bye.